The plate shattered first. Then came the scream. Mira dropped the tray of coffee cups the moment the man in the black coat gripped her wrist across the diner counter, and the entire restaurant froze, forks halfway to mouths, a baby crying somewhere near the window, the bell above the door still swinging from his entrance. 48 hours, he said, low enough that only she could hear it, but loud enough that her whole body went cold. Marry him, or your mother loses the house. Your choice, waitress. Then he let go, straightened his coat, and walked out into the rain as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb inside her chest. Mira stood there, glass at her feet, coffee soaking into her sneakers, and for the first time in 3 years of grinding double shifts to survive, she did something she never let herself do in public.
She cried.
Not quiet tears. The kind that come from somewhere old, somewhere buried, somewhere that had been waiting for permission to break. Nobody in that diner knew her name was about to be spoken in rooms she'd never enter, by men she'd never meet, in a language she barely understood. Nobody knew that behind the tinted windows of a car idling across the street, someone had been watching her for 11 months. Not the man who'd just threatened her, but someone else entirely. Someone whose name made grown men in tailored suits lower their eyes. And in exactly 48 hours, he was going to walk through that same diner door, sit down at her section, and change the rest of her life. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because you do not want to miss where this one goes. Drop a like if you're already invested and comment "I felt that" if you know exactly what it's like to have your whole world balanced on a knife's edge. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Her name was Mira Alvarez, 29 years old, and if you'd asked her a year earlier what her life would look like, she would have told you. Waitressing at Rose's Diner on the corner of 9th and Lincoln, saving every spare dollar for her mother's medication, and dreaming, quietly, secretly, the way people dream when they've stopped believing dreams come true, of one day opening a small bakery with nothing but flour, sugar, and her grandmother's recipes. She had her mother's stubbornness and her late father's gentle eyes, and she had learned, the hard way, that the world does not reward gentle people. It uses them. Her father had died when she was 22, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy that vanished within a year into medical bills for her mother's declining heart condition. Her older brother had left for Chicago and rarely called. So it had been Mira, alone, working mornings at the diner and evenings cleaning offices downtown, coming home each night to check her mother's oxygen levels before collapsing into bed for 4, sometimes 5 hours of sleep. She wasn't bitter about it. That was the strange, quiet strength in her. She simply kept going, the way water keeps finding a path downhill even when the rocks refuse to move. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning, steam rising off the griddle, the smell of burnt toast and cheap coffee thick in the air, that a man walked into Rose's Diner and sat in booth 7, her section, for the first time. He wore a charcoal gray coat that looked like it cost more than the diner's monthly rent, and he ordered black coffee and nothing else. He didn't smile. He didn't make small talk. He simply watched her work, quietly, the way a man studies something he's trying to understand rather than something he wants to possess. His name, she would later learn, was Jin-Ho Kong. But that morning, to her, he was just the man in booth 7 who tips too much and says too little. He came back the next day.
And the next.
For 2 weeks straight. Always the same booth. Always black coffee. Always leaving a $100 bill under his cup, without a word. Mira assumed he was lonely, or strange, or testing some kind of joke on the new waitress. She had no idea that Jin-Ho Kong was the eldest son of one of the most powerful Korean business families on the West Coast, a family whose business operated in the shadows between legitimate real estate holdings and something far more dangerous underneath. She had no idea that he had first heard her name from his own father, in a conversation that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with an old, unpaid debt her father had left behind before he died, a debt Mira never even knew existed. You see, years before Mira was born, her father had borrowed money from a man named Suho Baek, a loan shark with connections deep inside the Korean underground network, the same network the Kong family had spent 2 generations trying to dismantle and absorb. Her father had paid back most of it before he passed, But on paper, in ledgers that men like Suho Baek never forget and never forgive, there remained an outstanding balance. Interest compounds cruelly in that world. What started as a few $1,000s had, through decades of interest and threats, become a debt attached not to money, but to something crueler, an old-world contract that stated if the debt wasn't cleared, the borrower's family owed a marriage. An arranged bond meant to secure loyalty, alliance, or leverage, depending on who was asking. Barbaric, archaic, and, in the world Jinho Kong came from, still terrifyingly real. Suho Baek was the man who grabbed Myra's wrist in the diner that rainy afternoon. He wasn't threatening her out of cruelty alone. He was threatening her because he needed the Alvarez name tied to his organization before his rivals, the Kong family, could interfere. He needed Mira married into his circle within 48 hours before a certain business deal closed, because her father's old debt, buried for years, had suddenly become valuable again. Whoever controlled that marriage controlled a hidden asset, a piece of land Myra's father had once put up as partial collateral, land that, unknown to Mira, now sat on top of a multi-million-dollar development deal both families desperately wanted. Mira knew none of this. All she knew was that a stranger had grabbed her, threatened her mother's home, and given her 2 days to either disappear or say yes to something she didn't understand. That night, she sat by her mother's bedside, watching the oxygen machine hum its steady rhythm, and she made a decision that would haunt her for years. She decided not to tell her mother anything. Not yet. Instead, she sat on the fire escape outside their small apartment, phone in hand, scrolling through nothing, crying into the city noise below, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. That's when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A single text. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. I'm coming. She stared at it for a long moment, heart pounding, and somehow, she would never be able to explain why she believed it. If this story already has your heart racing, comment "I'm still watching" right now so we know you're locked until the very end, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you understand about the story. The next morning, Mira went to work as if nothing had happened, because what else was there to do? Rent didn't pause. Her mother's medication didn't pause. She tied her apron, forced a smile for the regulars, and refilled coffee cups with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. At 11:42 a.m., the bell above the door rang, and she looked up expecting anyone. A hungry trucker, a tired mother with kids, and instead found herself looking directly into the eyes of Jinho Kong. He didn't sit in booth 7 this time. He walked straight to the counter, straight to her, and set down a folded piece of paper. "Don't be afraid," he said quietly. "I know what happened yesterday. I know who grabbed you. And I know why." Myra's hands froze on the coffee pot. "Who are you?" she whispered. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to weigh every word before releasing it. "Someone who has been trying to protect you for longer than you know. And someone who is about to ask you to trust me completely, even though you have every reason not to." She wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. Instead, she just stood there, coffee pot trembling in her grip, staring at a man who spoke about her life like he'd read the whole book while she was still stuck on page 1. "Protect me from what?" she finally managed. Jinho's jaw tightened. "From a debt your father left behind. From a man who wants to use you as a pawn in a deal worth more money than this entire diner will make in 50 years. From a 48-hour deadline that isn't really about marriage. It's about land and power and men who don't care whether you live a happy life or a ruined one, as long as they win." Myra's world tilted sideways. Everything she thought she understood about her simple, hard, honest life cracked open, and underneath it was a truth far bigger and far darker than she'd ever imagined. "I don't understand any of this," she said, voice breaking. "I just want to take care of my mom. I don't want land. I don't want deals. I don't even know these people." Jinho's expression softened, just slightly, just enough for her to see something underneath the cold exterior, something that looked almost like guilt. "I know," he said. "And that's exactly why I'm not going to let them use you," he explained, carefully, quietly, without revealing everything, because in his world, revealing everything got people killed. That Suho Baek's ultimatum wasn't really a marriage proposal. It was a trap disguised as tradition, designed to force her into a contract that would hand over rights to land her father had unknowingly tied to a decades-old agreement. If she refused, Baek's men would make her mother's life unbearable. Eviction, harassment, worse. If she agreed and married one of Baek's chosen men, she would become legally bound to an organization that would use her, quietly, as leverage for the rest of her life. So, what am I supposed to do? Mira asked, tears building despite every effort to hold them back. I have 48 hours. Actually, now, less than that. Jinho looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the words that would end up changing the entire trajectory of her life. You marry me instead. The diner went silent around her, or maybe it was just her own mind that went silent, because for a moment, all Mira could hear was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. What? She whispered. I don't even know you. I know, Jinho said. But it's the only way to legally sever the contract before Baek can execute it. Marriage supersedes the old agreement if it happens within the same window, under a stronger family name. Mine is stronger. It will end this, permanently, if we move fast enough. Mira searched his face for a lie, for a trick, for anything that would explain why a stranger in an expensive coat was offering to marry her to save her from a nightmare she didn't even know existed 24 hours ago. She found nothing but sincerity, layered under something else, something she couldn't quite name yet, something that looked almost like longing. Why would you do this for me? She asked. You don't even know me. Jinho was quiet for a long time before he answered. Because your father saved my father's life once, a long time ago, before any of this business between our families turned ugly. And because I've been coming to this diner for 2 weeks, watching you work 16-hour days without a single complaint, and I have never in my life met someone who deserved protecting more than you. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected, and Mira felt something crack open inside her chest. Not fear this time, but something far more dangerous. Hope. She didn't say yes right away. She went home that night and told her mother everything, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding her mother's frail hand while the oxygen machine hummed its steady rhythm in the background. Her mother, who had survived so much, the loss of a husband, a failing heart, a country she'd left behind decades ago in search of something better, listened without interrupting, and when Mira finished, her mother squeezed her hand and said something Mira would carry with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes the scariest doors lead to the safest rooms, Mija. Don't let fear make the decision that your heart should be making. The wedding, if you could even call it that, happened 29 hours later, in a small courthouse downtown, with nothing but a justice of the peace, 2 witnesses Jinho trusted with his life, and Myra's mother in a wheelchair, tears streaming down her face for reasons that had nothing to do with sadness. Mira wore a simple cream dress she'd bought in under 20 minutes from a shop 3 blocks from the diner. Jinho wore the same charcoal coat he always wore, but underneath it, for the first time, Mira noticed his hands were shaking too. You don't have to be nervous, she whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin. This isn't real, remember? It's just paperwork. Jinho looked at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face that made her breath catch. Is it? He asked quietly, and then the justice of the peace called them forward, and there wasn't time to answer. If this story has already gripped your heart the way it's gripping mine right now, make sure you're subscribed, because we are just getting started, and what happens over the next 24 hours is going to test everything Mira thought she understood about safety, love, and the price of survival. Suho Baek did not take defeat quietly. Within hours of the courthouse marriage being filed, word reached him that the Alvarez debt had been legally absorbed and nullified through the Kong family's intervention, a move so bold, so unexpected, that it sent shockwaves through both organizations. Baek, humiliated in front of his own men, in front of business partners who had been counting on that land deal closing in his favor, did what men like him always do when they lose control. He turned to fear. 2 nights after the wedding, Mira received a call at the diner from an unknown number. When she answered, there was no voice on the other end. Just silence, Then the faint sound of her mother's oxygen machine beeping in the background, a sound that should never have been audible unless someone was standing inside her mother's apartment. Myra's blood turned to ice. She dropped everything, ran the 6 blocks home without stopping, and burst through the door to find her mother safe, terrified, but safe, and a note left on the kitchen table that read simply, "This isn't over. Ask your husband what happens to people who take what isn't theirs." When Jinho arrived 20 minutes later, his expression had changed entirely from the calm, controlled man Mira had married. This was something else, something colder, sharper. The version of him that had clearly survived in a world she was only beginning to understand. "I need you and your mother to come with me," he said, voice tight. "Tonight. Now." Mira, exhausted and terrified, finally let the anger she'd been suppressing since Booth 7 boil over. "You told me this would end it. You told me marrying you would make this stop." Jinho's jaw clenched. "It should have. Beck is supposed to honor the old rules. He's breaking them, which means he's more desperate than we thought, which means this is more dangerous than I let myself believe." "You lied to me," Mira said, voice breaking. "No," Jinho said firmly, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into his own face, the weight he'd clearly been carrying long before he ever walked into that diner. "I told you what I believed to be true. I did not know he would be this reckless. But I am telling you now, with everything I am, I will not let anything happen to you or your mother, even if it costs me everything I have." There was something in the way he said it, not the calculated confidence of a businessman making a promise, but the raw, unguarded honesty of a man who had already decided, somewhere along the way, that Mira Alvarez mattered to him far beyond the terms of a contract. And despite every instinct screaming at her to run, to scream, to demand answers she wasn't sure he even had, Mira found herself nodding, gathering her mother's medications with trembling hands, walking out into a black car waiting outside with 2 men she didn't recognize standing guard. They spent the next 3 days in a secured property on the outskirts of the city, a beautiful, quiet estate that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, no matter how gently Jinho tried to make it feel otherwise. It was during those 3 days, locked away from the world, that Mira finally saw who Jinho Kong really was underneath the coat, underneath the cold business exterior, underneath the family name that made men afraid. He told her about his childhood, a mother who died when he was 12, a father who raised him inside a world of power and violence disguised as legacy, a life where trust was a currency more dangerous than money because it could get you killed faster than a gun. He told her about the years he spent trying to legitimize the family business, trying to pull it away from the shadows his father had built it in, only to be pulled back in every time old debts, old contracts, old enemies resurfaced. "I never wanted this life," he admitted one night, sitting across from her at a kitchen table neither of them could sleep away from. "I used to dream about something simple. A quiet house. Ordinary problems. I used to think that dream was stupid, until I met a waitress who reminded me it wasn't." Mira felt something shift inside her chest, something dangerous and warm and terrifying all at once. "You watched me for 2 weeks before any of this happened," she said quietly. "Why?" Jinho was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee like the answer might be hiding somewhere at the bottom of the cup. "Because my father told me about your father's debt 6 months ago, and he wanted me to find a way to collect on it before Beck could use it as leverage. I came to that diner to study you, to find your weaknesses, to figure out how to control the situation." He looked up, and his eyes held something that looked almost like shame. "Instead, I found someone who worked 18-hour days without complaint, who gave free coffee to homeless men on cold mornings, who never once let exhaustion turn her cruel to the people around her. I stopped looking for weaknesses. I started looking for excuses to come back." The confession hung between them, fragile and enormous, and for the first time since the whole nightmare began, Mira didn't feel like a pawn in someone else's game. She felt seen. But peace, in a world like Jinho's, never lasts long. On the 4th night, Soho Beck made his move. It happened fast. A breach in the estate's security, a shootout that lasted less than 90 seconds but felt, to Mira like it stretched across an entire lifetime. She would remember it later only in fragments. Jinho shoving her behind him, shouting something in Korean to the men guarding the house, the deafening crack of gunfire echoing off marble floors, her mother screaming from the safe room where they'd hidden her, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and then silence. Terrible, ringing silence. When it was over, two of Beck's men lay wounded on the estate grounds, captured by Jinho's security team. Beck himself had not come personally. Cowards like him rarely did, but the message was unmistakable. This was no longer a business dispute. This was war, and Mira was standing directly in the middle of it, married to a man whose entire existence now revolved around keeping her alive. In the chaos afterward, bleeding from a graze wound along his forearm that he barely seemed to notice, Jinho grabbed Mira by the shoulders, checking every inch of her for injury with a desperation that had nothing to do with contracts or debts or old family obligations. "Are you hurt? Look at me. Are you hurt?" His voice cracked on the last word, and Mira, shaking, tears streaming down her face, shook her head. I'm okay, Jinho. Are you your arm?" He pulled her into his chest before she could finish the sentence, holding her so tightly it was as if he were trying to prove to himself, with his own hands, that she was still breathing. "I almost lost you," he whispered into her hair, voice raw in a way she had never heard from him before. "I told myself I could keep this separate. I told myself I could protect you without letting myself feel anything. I was wrong. I have never been so wrong about anything in my entire life." If your heart is pounding right now the way Myra's was in that moment, comment below and tell us what you would have done in her position, because what she chooses to do next is going to determine everything for her family, for her future, and for a love neither of them saw coming. In the aftermath, something between them had irreversibly changed. What began as a desperate, legal arrangement to escape a nightmare had somehow, impossibly, become something neither of them was prepared for. Mira found herself no longer flinching at his presence, but leaning into it. Jinho found himself no longer calculating risk before every decision involving her, but simply acting, protecting her not because it was strategic, but because the thought of anything happening to her had become unbearable. 2 weeks passed. Beck, weakened by the failed attack and the exposure it brought from both families' rivals watching closely from the shadows, was forced into a fragile truce brokered by elders on both sides, the kind of uneasy peace built on mutual exhaustion rather than trust. The land dispute was resolved quietly, the old debt formally erased, buried under new paperwork that made sure no one could ever resurrect it again. Myra's mother, finally free of the fear that had shadowed the family for years, began to heal, not just physically, but in the quiet, unspoken ways that come from finally feeling safe. But safety brought its own reckoning. With the danger gone, Mira had to face a harder question, one that had nothing to do with contracts or debts, and everything to do with her own heart. Did she stay married to Jinho Kong because circumstances had forced her into it? Or because, somewhere between Booth 7 and gunfire in a moonlit courtyard, she had genuinely fallen in love with a man the world had taught her to fear? She found him one evening on the back terrace of the estate, staring out at the city lights in the distance, looking more like a tired man than a powerful heir to anything. "The debt's cleared," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. Bex backed off. "My mom's safe. You don't owe me anything anymore, and I don't owe you anything either." Jinho didn't turn to look at her, but she saw his hands tighten on the railing. "Is that your way of asking for a divorce?" he asked quietly. Myra's breath caught. "Is that what you want?" A long silence stretched between them, filled with everything neither of them had said out loud yet. Finally, Jinho turned to face her, and in the soft evening light, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't let herself hope for, vulnerability, entirely unguarded. "No," he said, voice steady despite everything. "What I want is for you to stay, not because of a contract, not because of debt, not because your safety depends on it. I want you to stay because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as an obligation and started seeing you as the only good, honest thing left in a life I've spent years trying to survive rather than live. I want you to stay because I love you, Mira. Not the idea of protecting you." "You." All of you. The exhaustion, the stubbornness, the way you still smile at strangers even after everything this world has taken from you. Mira felt tears rising, but this time, they weren't born from fear. I was so scared this whole thing was just about paperwork, she whispered. That none of it was real. Jinho closed the distance between them, gently cupping her face in his hands. It stopped being paperwork the second I watched you cry in that diner, holding a broken coffee cup like it was the only thing you had left to lose. I have never wanted anything to be real more than I want this. And there, on the terrace, under a sky finally free of threats and debts and 48-hour deadlines, Mira Alvarez, the waitress who had once believed her life would always be defined by survival, chose, for the first time, to believe in something more. She chose him, not because she had to,
because she wanted to.
That night, they talked until the sky began to lighten at the edges, the way it does before anyone admits morning has arrived. Mira told him things she had never told anyone, not even her mother, about the nights she had sat awake doing math in her head, counting tips against rent, counting sleep against shifts, counting years against how much longer her mother's heart might hold out. She told him about the bakery she used to sketch on diner napkins during slow hours, little floor plans and menu boards she never let herself believe would exist outside of paper. Jinho listened the way no one had ever listened to her before, not waiting for his turn to speak, not offering solutions she hadn't asked for, just listening, as if every small, ordinary thing she'd survived mattered as much as the danger they'd just walked through together. In return, he told her about the parts of his life he rarely spoke about with anyone, the funerals he'd attended before he turned 18, the men his father had trained him to become before he'd had the chance to decide who he wanted to be, the years he'd spent quietly redirecting family assets into legitimate businesses, one contract at a time, hoping that someday there would be nothing left of the old world to inherit. I used to think I'd die before I ever got to choose an ordinary life, he admitted, watching the sun climb over the hills in the distance. Now, I keep thinking about mornings like this one, about wanting more of them, with you. There were harder days ahead, of course, there always are, in a life built on the ashes of something dangerous. Suho Baek's truce held, but barely, and for months afterward, Jinho's security team remained a quiet, constant presence at the edges of Myra's life, a reminder that peace, once broken, takes time to fully trust again. There were nights Mira woke from nightmares of shattering glass and gunfire, reaching instinctively for Jinho beside her before her breathing slowed. There were arguments, too, about how much to tell her mother, about how much of his old-world Jinho was still quietly untangling himself from, about the fear that never fully leaves a person once they've learned how quickly safety can be taken away. But they faced each of those nights together, which was, Mira came to understand, the entire difference between the life she had feared and the one she was slowly learning to trust. Her brother flew in from Chicago for the small, second ceremony they held 8 months later, a real one this time, not a rushed courthouse filing but a warm afternoon in her mother's backyard, string lights strung between 2 old oak trees, the smell of her grandmother's recipes drifting out from a borrowed kitchen. Rosa, her old boss from the diner, cried through the entire thing and later admitted she'd known something was different about the quiet man in booth 7 from the very first week he started coming in. Even some of Jinho's own family attended, cautiously, awkwardly, watching a version of their world they hadn't seen in a long time, one without threats attached to it. Because that was the real lesson buried underneath all the fear, the danger, the desperate 48 hours that once felt like the end of everything. Months later, Rosa's diner still stood on the corner of 9th and Lincoln, though Mira no longer worked there every day. She still visited, though, every Tuesday morning, sitting in booth 7 with a cup of black coffee, remembering the version of herself who once thought her story was over the moment a stranger grabbed her wrist and gave her 48 hours to disappear into someone else's plan for her life. Her mother's health had stabilized, her medical bills a distant memory now, her small apartment traded for a quiet house not far from the estate where everything had nearly fallen apart. And true to a promise Jinho made her the night everything changed, They had begun building something neither the diner nor the underground world had ever offered her: a small bakery tucked into a quiet street downtown, filled every morning with the smell of her grandmother's recipes and the sound of her own laughter, finally, unguarded and free. Because that was the real lesson buried underneath all the fear, the danger, the desperate 48 hours that once felt like the end of everything. Sometimes the moment that looks like your life falling apart is actually the moment it finally begins to make sense. Sometimes the thing you're running from is standing right next to the thing you've been searching for all along. And sometimes the scariest doors really do lead to the safest rooms, if you're brave enough to walk through them. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us telling it, make sure you're subscribed for more stories just like this one. Drop a like if you believe love can find people in the most unexpected circumstances, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Myra's place? Standing there with a broken coffee cup and 48 hours to change your entire life? We read every single comment, and we'll see you in the next story.